Returning now to the SICHAH in Siman 61 of the CHAVAT YAIR, in response to an issue regarding a goral that took place, the CHAVAT YAIR writes, in defense of the goral, that shekarov hadavar, one can be almost certain, she'im hagoral kahogan, that if the goral is conducted in the appropriate manner, then yidbak bo hashgacha elyona. Hashgacha elyona would be God's involvement. One can be assured that God's hashgacha would be reflected in the results of that goral. In the terminology that we have used thus far, the kahogan component would reflect the itaruta delatata, man doing what is incumbent upon him or her, and the hashgacha elyona is the response of itaruta dela'ela from HaKadosh Baruch manifesting itself in the results of the goral. Or in other words, the itaruta delatata generates a response from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that is metaphysical, l'ma'ala mitam v'da. The statement of the CHAVAT YAIR applied to the situation of goral. The Rebbe applies this paradigm to Torah study, that if one is involved in Torah study kehogan to the best of their capabilities, the hana'ah, kaviyachol, the God received, generates an itaruta dela'ela in response. This is the matana component of Torah, where man theoretically can access a level of Kedusha that is l'ma'ala mitam v'da. How this plays out in the real world needs to be defined. The same pattern will be used by the Rebbe in explaining the goral with respect to the division of land amongst the 12 Shvatim. What appears to be a random process was actually initiated from below, from mankind, resulting in a metaphysical response reflected in the decision of the goral. During the Middle Ages, pre-Enlightenment, God was still the center of man's universe, not just amongst the Jews, and very often matters were decided based upon chance. An example of the way community took for granted this interaction between God and man can be seen in the way they dealt with violation of community mores, the trial by ordeal, where the accused was subjected to a situation involving potential loss of life. The accused was considered innocent if they escaped injury or if their injuries healed. A variation of this in medieval Europe was a trial by combat, the duel, for example, a procedure based on the premise that God would help the innocent by performing a miracle on their behalf. Fortunately, Judaism, while maintaining a strong belief in hashgacha elyona, did not adopt these methods for administering justice. However, the concept of goral, a Ruach HaKodesh behind-the-scenes control over the outcome, did remain. The goral, in this context, was certainly something more than a raffle. The concept of mazal tov may also fit into this rubric. The CHAVAT YAIR in Siman 61, in responding to a legal issue, activates the concept of goral, and in doing so notes that this concept is not something that is foreign to the Jewish tradition, as we see in the case of the distribution of land, in the case of Yehoshua when he needed to identify the individual who had violated the cherem and thereby causing a plague to break out amongst the people, and the most famous of all goralot, the setting of the date for the annihilation of the Jews, resulting in the Chag of Purim. While not part of the SICHAH, the situation in which the CHAVAT YAIR makes his observation regarding the validity of the goral relates to a real-life situation in which a goral was used to determine the ownership of a silver goblet. It turns out that the 12 people, one of whom was the CHAVAT YAIR, came together on Chag Purim, the Chag named for a goral, and conducted their own goral. For argument's sake, let's suggest that the goblet was donated to the group of 12, and it was decided that ownership of the goblet would be determined through the system of goral. 12 names were placed into one barrel, and 12 identical objects were placed into another. One of the 12 objects had the words Mazal Tov written or engraved into it, while the remaining 11 were left blank. One name was to be drawn from the names barrel, and one item was to be drawn from the barrel containing the 12 objects. The first name to receive the Mazal Tov object would receive the goblet. As it turns out, the very first name drawn from the names barrel also drew the Mazal Tov object, which undoubtedly raised a number of eyebrows. A check was made of the 12 objects, and lo and behold, rather than having 11 blank and 1 Mazel Tov, they discovered there were 10 blanks and 2 Mazel Tovs, which would have put into question the validity of the entire goral. Decision was made to redo the goral, Same thing happened. The goblet was assigned to the first name that came out of the barrel. Once again, they checked the objects and the names, and this time, while there was only one Mazel Tov object, the names barrel contained only 11 names. Whether this was pure luck or whether somebody was tampering with the Goral as a Purim joke, the CHAVAT YAIR ruled that She'im HaGoral Kahogan, if technically the Goral was done without any ulterior motives and without intent to undermine the Goral amongst the participants, then one can be reassured that Yidbak bo hashgacha ha'elyona, that the outcome of that Goral would be one that could be linked to the hashgacha ha'elyona. The Rebbe in the SICHAH uses this obscure decision of the CHAVAT YAIR by applying it to the Goral that was conducted by Yehoshua in distributing Eretz Canaan amongst the 12 Shvatim. That although the Goral appeared to be the consequence of randomness, nevertheless there was the Shekhinah component as reflected in the use of the Urim V'Tumim. And at this point the question can be turned around, that if one had the Urim V'Tumim, why was there a need for the Goral?